Okay, we have a very nice spread of an audience spread out all across the world, from the Bohemian Forest to Dalmatia, Deutschland, Bogota, Montreal, Tel Aviv, and beyond. So this is a really full spec. I'm really happy with the turnout today, and I'm really happy and honored that we have as a guest today delivering the Rising Tide lecture this Sunday, Ray McGovern, the legendary Ray McGovern himself, who needs no real introduction. The world right now is moving through some very vicious storms. There's a lot of potential, as we all know, for good and for great evil, great destruction. A lot of this is going to be determined by the choices that we make, the ideas that we choose to tolerate or fight for, and the lessons of history weigh heavily upon our shoulders, because obviously bad decisions have taken their toll on human civilization as people have chosen to embrace folly, ignore corruption, ignore wrong ideas for a very long time. And we've had history littered with chaos, destruction, injustice, wars, and dark ages for a very long time in various cultures. So we don't want to do that again, especially not with a world that has tapped into the power of the atom, as our world has. What I find I'm very happy about this, because a lot of us, myself, everyone here, most people here, have, for the most part, tried to wrap our minds around the contours of history. We're trying to make sense of what are the forces that brought us here, what are the options available to get us out as a species of this crisis. Very few of us have lived through directly participating in the shaping of that contour as it unfolded. So Ray is one of those few people who I know who has had not only a front row seat, but has directly participated in the discussions that have shaped the decisions, for good and for bad, that have brought us to where we are today. And he has a lot to talk about. He's been on the front lines in a variety of ways. He's a CIA analyst since the early 60s, has briefed several presidents, many other major officials around the US policy circles. And when the world started getting especially crazy, and the US really, I guess you could say, lost its marbles in a more overt way than anyone expected possible, Ray decided to work with some colleagues and set up an organization, which I think is very important, as a discussion platform, as a policy, as a place for citizens diplomacy to take effect, called Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, where he has been really just speaking truth to power for 20 plus years. And so today, Ray is going to enlighten us and shed some light on some of the major developments around the world, how to think about the current crisis. And Ray, I'm not going to say anything more except to say for the audience that when you do have a question at the very end, after Ray's main presentation is done, please put your name in the queue in the chat box. I'll call upon you. And if you don't want to ask your question directly yourself, let me know and write it out very clearly what the question is, and I will ask it to Ray. Ray, it's all yours.
Sounds great. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for your introduction. I guess my major qualification here is that I have a little bit more history than most of the others of you, just by longevity, so to speak. I also have had a lot of experience weighing some of the main issues that arise today. And I'm talking about Russia, China, Eastern Europe, Ukraine. I can in no way pretend, as Colin Powell did on the 5th of February, 2003, that what I say would be irrefutable and undeniable. People who know me know that I've been wrong on a couple of major things, the most recent of which was not thinking that Putin would invade Ukraine. I convinced myself that he'd set for half a loaf, he'll settle for half a loaf, and that would be the removal of these intermediate and short-range ballistic missiles that were going to the ostensible ABM sites in Poland, Romania, and eventually Ukraine. I was wrong. I was dead wrong. So I confess up front that I'm not irrefutable, and I'm not, what's the other word, undeniable. I do what I can. Just as a matter of an aside here, We veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity, as Matthew mentioned, our first major work, our first kind of collegial work was on 5 February 2003, the afternoon after which Colin Powell spoke. I just want to read again how we ended this thing. It was a memo in the same format we used to use when we were on active duty, so to speak, memo for the president. And we said, Mr. Bush, at the end, you need to widen this discussion about Iraq beyond the circle of those advisors clearly bent on a war for which we see no compelling reason and from which we believe the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic. We take no pleasure in having been right about that. All I'm saying here is that that's exactly the same message we would give to President Joe Biden. My God, when you look at the advisors that he's listening to, well, enough said about that for the present. Matt and I were talking recently about my experience when I first came on board after my military service as an infantry intelligence officer with the CIA, which was under John Kennedy in April of 1963. My account, after I went through all the training stuff, was Sino-Soviet relations from the Soviet perspective. I couldn't have fallen into a luckier sort of portfolio. The very experienced analyst that had handled that had just left, and so I was on the foreign policy branch, Soviet foreign policy branch. That was my account. I had responsibilities for relations between Russia and China, between Russia and the Far East, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the international communist movement. So, although I am very proud of being an area specialist, that is, my advanced degree is in Russian studies, I'm also aware that I had unusually broad experience, exposure to the rest of the world by virtue of having to follow the international communist movement, such as it was in those days, and it was, and particularly relations with China. Now, when I came on board, actually as an analyst, which was January 1964, there was great doubt as to whether we analysts were being taken in by Russian Chinese propaganda. They were calling each other great power chauvinists. They were calling all kinds of names, but people like James Jesus Angleton and other hardcore Cold Warriors would say, you analysts, you pinkos, you're being taken in. These are communists. They'll always get along. Communists are the communists. And that reverberated all the way down to when Bill Casey took over. And Bobby Gates says, yes, you're right, Mr. Casey. A communist is a communist. Gorbachev is just the cleverer communist. Anyway, if you can go back to the day, we had to prove to the policymakers, number one, that they were at each other's throats, literally. Now, the propaganda didn't do it. The Uyghur broadcasts, the broadcasts from Russia to Xinjiang in China, which pretty much was stirring up insurrection, they didn't do it either. What did it was the appearance in our aerial photography of 15 Soviet divisions, the best divisions they had on the Chinese border. Then later it grew to about 30, 35, and more. What did that mean? Well, that meant everybody realized that this was real and that it was debilitating for both sides. And when Nixon and Kissinger came in, they realized, hey, maybe we could take advantage of this, right? So all the naysayers, so let me just give you an example of the hurdles that we faced. at the height of this dispute, it was probably around 1968, 69, a MiG-19 appeared on the apron in front of the Shenyang airframe factory in China. So these troglodytes like James Jesus Angleton said, see, you say the Russians hate the Chinese. Why are they giving them MiG-19s? The state of the art. My God, yeah, forget about the Sino-Soviet dispute. Now, we asked, well, isn't that don't they make planes there? Yeah, but it's a MiG-19, for God's sake. So finally, it took 2 years. Well, we got a defector, a Chinese defector. He came through our defector system there. And we said, hey, you're from Shenyang. Yeah. Well, tell us about that Shenyang airframe factory. So I worked there. I said, oh, yeah, well, tell us about it. Well, we had to wear 5 overcoats because there was no heating. And so we said, well, what does that mean? Well, it was just awful duty. And then we remembered these folks, the troglodytes, had said they can't be making them. The Chinese can't be making these MiG-19s. Why? Because there's snow on the roof. Snow on the roof. What does that mean? Well, that means you have to have heating to make MiG-19s, for God's sake. So if there's snow on the roof, there's nothing going on in that airframe plane. And here's this refugee saying, oh my God, it was free. 5 overcoats. Yeah, that's what we did. We produced MiG-19s. That's how much distrust we faced then. Now, Nixon and Kissinger came into power and said, I think we can probably, take advantage of this. And we found that this was very welcome because we didn't agree with anything else Kissinger did. Because, we were pretty much personae non gratae down in the White House and the State Department. But we could say that this was a clever move, very clever move. And as you know, Nixon went to China after the trip being prepared by Kissinger in the fall of 1991. And then he was scheduled to come to Moscow to do the honors to sign the ABM treaty in 1992. I'm sorry, we're talking about 1971 and 1972. So what does this mean? Well, this meant that we had a chance to tell Kissinger and Nixon, you're right. The Russians are seeing their effort as trying to block a rapprochement between China and the United States before, to take advantage of Russia. And that was indeed the case. I learned from my friend Chaz Freeman that Mao was very worried about those Soviet divisions on the Chinese border. And that was a very tangible reflection of Chinese fears. So long story short, as we started telling the powers that be in Washington that this was likely to work, that the Russians were showing signs of more flexibility on other issues, lo and behold, something that could never be solved, the 4-power agreement on Berlin, all of a sudden, the Russians showed enough flexibility to get that deal done. This was in the same time period. So now I was head of the Soviet foreign policy branch at the time. I had been promoted to that position. And I had 3 people that I seconded to the SALT delegation, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks delegation. One with the delegation in Helsinki or Vienna, wherever they were. One in the bowels of the CIA headquarters with the military experts, and one with my branch writing up the negotiations, trying to elucidate for Kissinger how we saw it. Did we think that the Russians were really interested in coming to an agreement on strategic arms? And we said, yes, we did. And what were one of the signs? Well, flexibility, like the agreement on Berlin, and their ability to forget about Vietnam. not support Hanoi in any way, but rather see the Vietnam conflict as a function of the Sino-Soviet conflict, trying to demean and destroy the Chinese in any possible vocal way they could. So what happens? I get to go to the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks signing, the SALT Treaty. And this is just an incredible personal as well as professional experience for me. I mean, I was one of those people who grew up hiding under my desk so I could escape the fallout from Russian atomic bombs, right? I used to walk around New York City thinking, oh my God, you know, they're building this new skyscraper. Don't they know that one little button and it's all gone? You know? So here I am in Moscow, 1972, May it was, watching the signing of this agreement, which lasted 30 years, okay? 30 years. I didn't know it would last 30 years, but I did know what it meant. For those of you who are not familiar with the ABM treaty, it was really pretty simple. Both countries were building up their offensive and their defensive missiles to fairly well. They were running out of money. And more enlightened souls said, you know, we ought to do a deal here. If we limited the number of defensive, that is anti-ballistic missile sites, neither side could ever even think that they could make a first strike and escape inevitable destruction with a retaliatory strike. Made real sense. Okay, they started out with 2 sites, 2 ABM sites, and then they limited it to 1 ABM site. And our job was to tell Kissinger not only, yes, we think the Russians are really interested in this. Yes, we think they see themselves in competition with China for good relationships with Washington, but also that we could verify. Doverai no proverai. Trust, but verify. Kissinger says to us, are the Russians going to cheat? We said, don't know, probably. He said, well, how soon can you tell us if the Russians cheat? Week, 2 weeks tops. Okay, that's enough for us to doverai, to trust. So it was a real high to see that our agency and the community itself, sort of Jack Matlock and the State Department, were able to rise to the occasion and conclude this deal. Now, just as sort of an aside, did the Russians cheat? Yes, the Russians cheat. Did we catch them? Yeah. In 12 days? Yeah. What did they do? Well, they built a giant ABM radar out in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. It was a phased array radar, and well, it was oriented in such a way that it had to be ABM radar, precluded, forbidden by the SALT Treaty. So what did Reagan do? This was in '83. Reagan said, we got you. Show them the photos. We showed the Russians the photos. No, that's not an ABM site. No. Well, it took 5 years of painstaking negotiations. Actually, that's the way we used to do things. And finally, Gorbachev says, oh yeah, okay, it's an ABM radar, tear the thing down. So that was the first thing that Reagan said, and Bush later, okay, tear it down, tear down that radar. That gives you an example of how I come at all this and how I saw the Sino-Soviet nexus as being a really important part of what international relations scholars call the balance of power, what the Russians, the Soviets used to call the world correlation of forces. Now, let me have the first slide, please, Matt, if you would. I've just talked about the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and I tried to explain a little bit how it came to be partly because we exploited this drive on the part of the Soviet Union not to let China outpace it in cultivating good relationships with the United States. It talked about how Doverai, no proverai, worked. We trusted. They violated. We verified, and they tore it down. Again, that's the way we used to do things. Now, how about the 1987 Intermediate Forces Treaty? Ah, wow. You know, when somebody told me that Gorbachev in 1985 had said, all right, Mr. Reagan, you're not willing to ban all nukes, but how about just the ones that we don't need, the ones that are in the Russian part of the Soviet Union, the European part, and the ones, the Pershing II missiles that you have in Europe. Let's get rid of them. And Reagan said, "You think we can get rid of them?" He said, "Yeah, well, let's just do it." Well, they did it. How were they able to do it? Because of doverai no proverai. Trust is the coin of the realm here. We trusted because we could verify. This time, and I repeat, I'll say it 2 times. This time they didn't violate that one. We had inspectors all over. Scott Ritter has just published a book on this. It's an excellent book. You ought to get a hold of it. It's just out. He talks about his experience as an inspector, verifying the destruction of SS-20 missiles in the wild of Siberia. Now, what happened? What happened to the 1972 ABM treaty? Well, when Bush Jr. came into the presidency, he brought with him a very disreputable group. One's name was Cheney, one's name was Rumsfeld. And they were a formidable foe of treaties and of good relations with Russia. I talked with Larry Wilkerson earlier today. He was, of course, with Colin Powell at the State Department. When Colin Powell realized that not only Rumsfeld and Cheney, but also John Bolton, who was ostensibly working for Powell at the time, were telling Bush he had to get out of the ABM treaty, Powell fought it as well as his stamina would, and was defeated. So the ABM treaty went by the board. Now, you're a Russian, right? And you say, well, what's this all about? How come they're getting out of the ABM treaty? 1987, INF treaty. Well, the ABM treaty lasted 30 years. The INF treaty lasted 32 years. Why do we get out of that? Mike Pompeo and his ilk. Okay. Why? Well, you're a Russian. Ask yourself, well, I wonder why. Yeah. Well, a lot of this has its own explanations, but some of it has to do with China. And I'm going to sort of draw on my experience with China and Sino-Soviet and Russian-Chinese relations over the last 5 decades, let's say. And may we have the next slide, please? Okay, now, after the Russians and the Chinese realized that it was really very self-debilitating to have this quarrel out in the open and let people like the US take advantage of it, more enlightened leadership came into Beijing and to Moscow, and they started chipping away at this animosity, okay? And they chipped away in such fashion that they became virtual allies. We'll go into that a little bit later, but under the pressure of being number 1 and 2 enemies of the United States and NATO in Asia now, they realized that they needed to get together. It was a natural, and so they did. Now, the only problem is that nobody told President Biden this. And this came into bas relief back last year. Last spring, you'll recall that when Russia started mobilizing troops and put them in en masse on the border with Ukraine, Biden got appropriately scared, and he called up Putin. And he said, you gotta tell me how many there are. How many troops? And Putin said, well, didn't you listen to what Shoigu, my defense minister, said earlier today? There are 2 full army divisions and 3 airborne detachments. That's a lot. That we call that asymmetrical. My God, we thought that was a lot. Now Biden says, well, now what are we going to do? And Putin said, well, the first thing you can do is call off Zelensky. He says he wants to take back Crimea by force. Call him off. You have the policy. You have the power to do that. Do it. Next thing you could do is you have 2 destroyers, heavily armed, very sophisticated destroyers on their way into the Black Sea. Turn them around. It's not a good idea to come into the Black Sea right now. Have them go somewhere else. What did Biden do? To his credit, he turned them around. They went to Greece, which is much nicer duty, okay? Third thing, Biden said, oh, let's have a summit. Out of the blue, let's have a summit. This all happened on the 13th of April, okay? Let's have a summit. And Putin, as was his wont, said, sure, we'll have a summit. Well, as soon as the date was set for the summit, the date set was June 16. I wrote a little piece saying, going into this summit, there's one thing you need to know, and that's what the Soviets used to talk about in terms of a world correlation of forces. John Mearsheimer would say, balance of power 101. Now, apparently, Blinken and Sullivan went to the finest schools, but they only took courses in American exceptionalism, American power, and they never did learn much about balance of power or the fact that there were other very powerful countries in the world. And so what we found out this is really sad, maybe you don't know this, but after the summit on the 16th of June, Biden, in his post-summit comments, said, it's not appropriate for me to say what I told Putin, but China's a big problem for Russia. There's this thousands of miles of border between the two. China aspires not to be only the economic powerhouse of the world, but the military. I tell you, Putin is being squeezed by China. Now, I would have loved to have been a bug on the wall, fly on the wall, when Putin turned to his advisors and said, huh? What's going on here? Doesn't he get it? And suffice it to add that the Chinese and the Russians spent most of the year last year trying to prove how close they were, how their alliance had no end, how their alliance was stronger, exceeds, is the word they use, a traditional alliance. Now, it may be short of an explicit military alliance, but it is, in my view, a virtual military alliance. So how does this track out? Well, Blinken, Sullivan, Biden didn't seem to learn a lot, but when the Russians threw down the gauntlet late last year, October, November, December, and gave a draft treaty saying, look, we don't want Ukraine and NATO, and we really need to smooth things down and respect our strategic area, to make sure that you recognize what we consider to be an existential threat. Well, What happened? Uh, what happened, I'll show in the next slide. But right now, I want to just emphasize that when Putin saw that he really needed to do what he ended up doing, he saw that because of what he saw as American duplicity, America going back on its word, just as it did way back in 1990, after 1990, with the promise not to move NATO 1 inch to the east. And so he pretty much gave up when he saw that the strengthened Ukrainian armed forces, strengthened by NATO countries, including the US, training them up to NATO standards, 10,000 a year for 6 years. Do the math. And when he saw them about to attack Donbass, Donetsk, and Lugansk, and when he saw the Nazis running things in these key areas, he went to Beijing to open the Olympics. Now, the Olympics started on the 4th of February. That's when he met with Xi Jinping, and that's when they issued an incredible document saying, we are in a virtual alliance. There is no end to our friendship or our commitment one to the other. You need to read it. It's really quite remarkable, okay? So what did Putin say to Xi about his intentions vis-a-vis Ukraine? Well, this is my interpretation now. This is not like I've just gone through just the facts, ma'am, just the facts, okay? My interpretation is that Putin said, now, look, the Americans promised this thing and then they renege on their promises. We're about to suffer an invasion of Lugansk and Donetsk. There are Nazis all over the place. We need to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. The only way we can do that, is by cleaning up the act there, going in there and cleaning them out. What do you think? Here's my impression of Xi Jinping. You mean after the Olympics are over, right? Right. Olympics end on the 20th of February. Lugansk and Donetsk are recognized as independent countries. The next day, 2 days later, you have the invasion of Ukraine. Now, why is that important? Well, I was really thinking that the Chinese would never bless this kind of thing. And I have to tell you, I'm not a Chinese specialist, but 9 out of 10 Chinese specialists that I consulted said, no, Xi Jinping would not ever give encouragement. He wouldn't even give a nihil obstat to that kind of thing, because their fundamental principle is non-interference in the affairs of the country, sovereignty, Westphalia, for God's sake. The Chinese are the last main defenders of the principles of the Westphalian Treaty. Whoa. And yet that's not how it turned out, right? So my reasoning is that Xi Jinping gave Putin at least a nihil obstat. And I think the proof is in the pudding. I think that the Chinese support, the Chinese refusal to participate in condemning Putin for what he's doing, and now Chinese support for, now Russia, the support by other people for what, by Russia's support for what China is doing, or what China's position is out in the Taiwan Strait. That's another thing we can talk about a little bit later. But for people who used to dissect communist propaganda, and I guess China is still a communist country, we keep being reminded that communist China. Well, okay, you look at their statements, and guess what happened to the Treaty of Westphalia? Well, they mention sovereignty every now and then, but they've made it clear that on this particular occasion, well, we gave Putin a waiver on non-interference, on sovereignty, and all this other business, which is our key thing, okay? So we gave them a waiver. And what do they say now, even in their rhetoric? They said, well, we assess the invasion and other events of this kind on their own merits. Now, that means something to me, because rhetoric in such closed societies, when it changes so basically, that means that they gave Putin a waiver on their principled opposition to invading other countries. Now, let's have, well, before we have the next slide, the real rub here, and the reason that I thought, erroneously, I confess, that Putin, if he could deal with the intermediate range missiles that were being emplaced or could be emplaced in the same holes that are called now anti-ballistic missile holes in Romania, already there, in Poland, almost completed, and lo and behold, in Ukraine, I thought that he'd take half a loaf. After all, that treaty that he tabled, I think it had 9 provisions. 6 of them had to do with these, in one way or another, intermediate range ballistic missiles. So, I was wrong. He decided to have more. Why was I wrong? We Chinese and Soviet analysts used to blame each other when one of us miscalculated. Well, I'm not going to blame all my Chinese expert friends, but if I had the faith in my own convictions here, I might have been able to see that Putin didn't have to settle for half a loaf. With Chinese agreement or Chinese blessing, he could go for the full loaf, and that's what he did. That's what he did. So what concerns Putin the most? Well, I think this next clip. Now, it's only 10 minutes, and you have to read the subtitles. But if you fall asleep, you're going to miss the whole thing. This is something he said in 2016. It's unique as far as I can tell, because no American media has played it. And here it is. Without further ado, let me introduce Putin talking to a group of Western journalists who were sort of a captive audience, because he invited them to hear how he felt about intermediate range ballistic missiles and what he saw going into Romania, Poland, and eventually Ukraine. And bear in mind, he talks about the balance of power, right? He could have talked about the old Soviet world correlation of forces, but he talks about the balance of power. He's a Mearsheimer man, balance of power, okay? The other thing is what? Oh yeah, he talks about what the Pentagon intends to do. And he says, мы знаем, we know, и они знают, что мы знаем. And they know that we know, and they go ahead anyway. Okay, so let's have this again. If you fall asleep, you're going to miss the whole thing. It's only 10 minutes. We'll come back and wrap up. Thanks.
Послушайте, вот здесь все очень взрослые люди и уже опытные. Мы с вами, я сейчас не буду просить, чтобы вы это все, вот так, как я скажу, отражали в своих материалах, влияли на прессу там, или как. Я просто вам, вот знаете, хочу вам лично сказать, напомнить какие-то вещи. Ведь мир избавлен от крупномасштабных войн и военных конфликтов. Мы с вами все об этом знаем. Благодаря так называемому стратегическому балансу, который был достигнут после того, как 2 суперядерные державы договорились фактически о сдерживании и в росте наступательных вооружений, и о сдерживании в системах противоракетной обороны. Потому что для всех понятно, если одна сторона развивает противоракетную оборону успешнее, чем вторая, то она приобретает преимущество, и у нее появляется искушение использовать это оружие первой. Поэтому это один из краеугольных камней международной безопасности. Система противоракетной обороны и договоренности в этой сфере. Я далек от того, чтобы кого-то ругать, обвинять в чем-то. Но когда наши партнеры американские вышли в одностороннем порядке, они нанесли колоссальный удар, или вот это был первый удар по международной стабильности с точки зрения возможности нарушения баланса сил стратегического. Тогда я сказал, ну, мы сейчас не можем развивать эти технологии, поскольку, дорого, во-вторых, еще неизвестно, как они будут работать. Мы не будем просто деньги палить. Мы пойдем по другому пути, мы будем совершенствовать ударные системы, чтобы сохранить баланс. Только для этого. Не для того, чтобы угрожать кому-то. Нам ответили, ну да, это вот наша система ПРО не против вас, а то, что вы делаете, мы исходим из того, что это не против нас. Ну и делайте, что хотите. Я думаю, что вот такой постановка вопроса, она связана с тем, я уже говорил, по-моему, сегодня на пленарном заседании, связана была с тем, что это же начало 2000-х годов. Россия находилась в очень сложном положении. Развал экономики, значит, фактически гражданская война и борьба с терроризмом на Кавказе, оборонная промышленность в развале, вооруженные силы в ужасном состоянии. Ну, кому в голову приходилось, что Россия сможет наращивать стратегические вооружения? Наверное, думали о том, что пройдет некоторое время, имеющиеся, доставшиеся от Советского Союза вооружения будут деградировать. Поэтому надо сказать, да делайте, что хотите. Но мы предупреждали, что мы будем это делать. Мы сказали об этом. И мы делаем. И я вас уверяю, сегодня Россия добилась существенных успехов на этом пути. Я сейчас не буду всего перечислять, но мы модернизировали наши комплексы. И успешно развиваем новые поколения. Я уже не говорю о системах преодоления, системах противоракетной обороны, но наши партнеры, несмотря на все наши возражения, на все наши предложения о реальном сотрудничестве, не хотят с нами сотрудничать, отвергают все наши предложения и действуют по своему плану. Я сейчас не буду, некоторые вещи считаю даже пока некорректным говорить публично. Но можете мне верить, можете не верить. Мы предлагали конкретные элементы, конкретный вариант сотрудничества. Они реально все были отклонены. Но вот все-таки пришли к тому, что сейчас построили систему ПРО в Румынии. Говорили это все время о чем? Нам нужно защититься от иранской ядерной угрозы. Где ядерная угроза иранская? Ее нет? Договор подписали уже. И причем Соединенные Штаты были, по сути, инициаторами этого договора с Ираном. Мы помогли, мы поддержали. Но если бы не позиция США, не было бы этого договора. И это, безусловно, заслуга президента Обамы. Потому что я считаю, это договор правильный, он разрядил ситуацию вокруг Ирана. И президент Обама может записать это, безусловно, в свой послужной список как результат своей работы на этом направлении. Но угрозы нет, а система ПРО продолжает строиться. Значит, мы были правы, когда говорили, что нас обманывают. С нами неискренне, ссылаясь на якобы имеющуюся иранскую ядерную угрозу при строительстве системы ПРО. Ну, так оно и есть на самом деле. В очередной раз пытались нас надуть. Сейчас построили эту систему, сейчас ставят там ракеты. Так? Но вам должно быть известно, что ракеты эти закладываются в капсулу, которая используется для пусков ракет средней дальности «Томагавк» морского базирования. Значит, туда закладывают сейчас антиракеты, способные поражать цели на расстоянии 500 километров. Но мы знаем, технологии развиваются. Мы примерно знаем, в каком году примерно американцы получат новую ракету, которая будет уже не 500 километров, а 1000, а потом больше. И с этого момента они начнут угрожать нашему ядерному потенциалу. Мы по годам знаем, что будет происходить. И они знают, что мы знаем. Это вам только вешают лапшу на уши, как у нас говорят. А вы, в свою очередь, вешаете своему населению. И люди не чувствуют опасности. Вот меня что беспокоит. Ну как мы не можем понять? Мы тащим мир вообще в совершенно новое измерение. Вот в чем проблема. Делают вид, что как будто ничего не происходит. Но я не знаю даже, как достучаться. И о чем говорят? Это часть оборонного потенциала, не наступательного. Это, значит, системы, которые призваны оградить от агрессии. Это неправда, это не так. Стратегическая система противоракетной обороны – это часть наступательного стратегического потенциала. И все это работает в единой связке с наступательными ударными комплексами. Одни прикрывают, одни наносят упреждающий удар высокоточным оружием, другие прикрывают от ядерного ответного удара, третьи, значит, наносят сами ядерный удар. Это все в комплексе решается. В комплексе современном неядерного исполнения высокоточным оружием. Значит, ну ладно, вот эти противоракеты, которые будут развиваться и будут все больше и больше нам угрожать. Но вот в эти чехлы, куда закладываются эти ракеты, я же сказал, что они берутся с кораблей, и там эти шахты, так скажем, используются для томагавков. Ну там можно вообще просто за несколько часов поставить туда томагавки и все. И это уже никакие не противоракеты. Откуда мы знаем, что там в этих шахтах находится? Нужно просто изменить программу. Все. Это работа абсолютно незаметная. До Румынии никто не будет знать, что там происходит. Их что, допускают румын туда, что ли? Никто не будет знать, ни румыны не будут знать, ни поляки не будут знать. Я знаю, как это делается. Но это, на мой взгляд, это большая опасность. Вот когда-то мы обсуждали с нашими партнерами американскими, у них была идея создания баллистических ракет в неядерном исполнении. И мы им тогда сказали: слушайте, ну вы понимаете, что это такое или нет? Вот у вас будут стартовать ракеты с подводных лодок, с территории. Стартует баллистическая ракета. Мы же не знаем, есть там ядерная головка или нет. Какую угрозу вы будете создавать? Но, насколько нам известно, сегодня эта программа не осуществляется. Они ее остановили пока. Но это продолжают. К чему это все придет, я не знаю. Но я знаю точно, что мы вынуждены будем отвечать. Только я уже заранее знаю, чтобы нас будут обвинять в агрессивном поведении, хотя это только ответ. Но ясно, что мы должны будем обеспечить безопасность. Не только свою. Но нам очень важно обеспечить стратегический баланс в мире. И еще раз вернусь к этому и закончу ответ на этот вопрос с того, с чего начал. Вот именно этот стратегический баланс гарантировал мир на планете, гарантировал нас от крупных вооруженных конфликтов за последние 70 лет. И это благо, хоть оно такое, знаете, основанное как бы на взаимной угрозе, но тем не менее взаимная угроза, она обеспечила нам глобальный мир на протяжении десятилетий. Как его можно разрушить, так я не знаю. Мне кажется, что это очень опасно. Не только кажется, я в этом уверен. Да, Соединенные Штаты.
We can stop that now.
Okay.
Thanks, Matt. Am I back on?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I noticed that I've gone over the time that I had allotted myself, but let me try to finish up quickly. That was 6 years ago. Did you see anything like that in the mainstream press?
No.
I mean, you saw Putin saying right off the bat, "Now, I don't expect you to get this into the mainstream press. I just want to listen to him personally." And then, you know, it's one of the few times I've seen Putin lose it. I mean, he's how am I going to get through to you guys? This is a real danger. This is how we're coping with it, but it's still really dangerous. And they know that we know what they're doing. Okay. Now, fast forward 6 years or 5 years to last December when Putin is addressing his top military, the four-star generals and admirals. And he's got Shoigu, the defense minister, there. And they're giving sort of like Shoigu's giving the state of the armed forces address, okay? But Putin makes a big address himself, okay? And what does he say? Can we have the next slide, please, there, Matt? This is what Putin says to the group assembled there on the 21st of December last year in Russia, in Moscow. He's talking about U.S. launchers that are, as I said already, in Romania, going into Poland, and they can launch Tomahawk. That's the way you say tomahawk in Russian, Tomahawk, strike missiles, okay? Now, he says to his assembled top military, this is extremely alarming, as you know. So what we need are concrete written treaties to prevent this from happening. We need to have something written down. Now, that much is factual. My interpretation, looking at the senior admirals and generals, is they're saying, right, Vladimir Vladimirovich, wasn't the ABM treaty written down? How about the INF treaty? Vladimir. So in the next sentence, he sort of says, well, we really need more than that. And then he explains. And this is also a quote. I should have put quotation marks around this. If missiles are deployed in Ukraine, the flight time to Moscow will be only 7 to 10 minutes. Or if they're hypersonic systems, 5 minutes. Implication. So they're going to give me 5 minutes or 7 to 10 minutes to decide whether I should blow up the rest of the world. What happens next is really interesting. I tend to watch these things really closely because that was my stock and trade. And so I noticed that at the very end of December, right after Putin made these remarks, the Kremlin makes it clear that Putin wants to talk to President Biden like now, right away. And the White House says, no, wait a second, our negotiators are getting together in Geneva on the 9th and 10th. For God's sake, wasn't that time enough? No, he wants to talk to him now. Now, why? We didn't get much in the way of readout from the American side, but maybe we have the next slide, please. This is what we heard from the Russian side, the Russian readout, which was never disputed in any authoritative way by officialdom. This is what they said. Joseph Biden emphasized that Washington had no intention of deploying offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Formal Kremlin readout from that telephone call of the 30th December. Whoa, do you know about that? There wasn't much publicity, if any, in the US press. What happened? What happened to that? It fell in the cracks. Now, you can use your own imagination as to who told Biden, forget about it, Joe. This is not how we proceed here. But Joe Biden forgot about it too, because we know that just 6 weeks later, on the 12th of February, when they had their next telephone call, we know this because Putin made clear in his readout that Biden's proposals did not really address non-deployment of strike weapon systems on Ukrainian territory. So this big, ostensible concession that no one disputes Joe Biden made on the 30th of December, by the 12th of February, had kind of frizzled out into nothingness. So, if trust is the coin of the realm, and a smart lawyer like Jimmy Baker can promise things like, if you accept the reunified Germany, I know it's a big thing for you, but yeah, except that we promise never to move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, that promise was broken. And here's Biden, the president of the United States, not just the Secretary of State, talking personally one-on-one to Putin at Putin's insistence and saying, yeah, we'll make this concession. And then what happens? It falls through the cracks. Now, just to wind up here, I think that, or I hope, that when you hear some administration spokesman say that the Russian attack on Ukraine was unprovoked, you will have more information to form your own judgment about that. Similarly, if the Chinese react as I expect them to the next group of warships the US sends into the Taiwan Strait, when officialdom calls that unprovoked, you will have your own ideas about, well, maybe that's not unprovoked either. So I just like to draw that analogy and say that the difference now is the stark change in the correlation of forces, or the balance of power, if you will. It doesn't seem that Biden or Blinken or not Blinken and Sullivan, they don't get it. They're educated in the best schools, but they've been sold a bill of goods about exceptionalism, about how the US is indispensable. And when I talk to college students, I say to them, well, you know that the US is indispensable, right? They say, well, yeah, that's what they say. Well, what is, you guys still know antonyms? And one or two will say, oh yeah, that's an opposite word. So I'll say, well, what's the antonym for indispensable? Dispensable? Well, yeah, ipso facto, all other countries are dispensable. So that, I think, is what Blinken and Nod and Sullivan learned. That's what they're telling Joe Biden. It's not going to work anymore. Why? Because the whole triangle that used to be associated with the Russia, China, US triangle used to be pretty much equilateral. Now it's, remember your geography? It's isosceles, like this, and who's got the short end? It's the US that has the short end. Now, if our policymakers don't recognize this by this time, we're in deeper trouble than we were a year or two ago. But I wish I could be more confident that these things are becoming apparent, and that with Russia moving on the offensive in Ukraine, and China being, in my view, appropriately reactive to what the US and others are doing vis-a-vis Taiwan, I think we can expect a lot of friction, and maybe worse. And maybe it's our job to spread the truth around and make sure that people are sensitized to the real balance of power. I would close with my favorite quote from Martin Luther King Jr. When I was teaching, I was always, I'd crammed this quote from the letter from the Birmingham City Jail into every course, whether it was politics or sociology. He said this about lying and about injustice. He said, like a boil that can never be cured unless it is exposed to the natural medicines of air and light with all its ugliness, so too injustice and lying must be exposed with all the friction this exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. We've got a lot of boils, We've got to expose them, however ugly the result. Otherwise, they're never going to be healed. And I'll leave you with that. I hope we can all join in this worthy effort to spread some truth around and educate those of our fellow Americans who just need to be educated on these things. Thanks very much for listening this long and not disturbing me. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray, so much. And I think we're going to have to dub you a doctor of geopolitical medicine, because really it is you are diagnosing and providing some remedies for healing the patient before the boils take over. I think that's a really, really strong way of looking at it. And just listening to you, it really became clear, something that I think we all sort of had an inkling of and a sense of, but just how outdated the playbook is that the current unipolaristas are holding on to. And they just can't seem to let go of this playbook that was written in the 60s. And somehow they still think that reality is something that it stopped being a long time ago. So thank you again. How long do you have? Because we've got a nice list of people who aching to ask you some questions. What's your time frame look like?
I'm Irish, so I have as much time as you like. My only caveat is that I tend to go on even in answering questions. So I want you to feel free to say, all right, that's enough of that one, Ray. Let's go to the next questioner. A deal?
I'll do what I can. So the first question that came in is from your friend Ed in Moscow, who asked me to read. It's a two-part question. It's very late in the day, in the evening in Moscow, so I'll bring this one on first. Ed's working on a particularly interesting project, and what you're going to say is going to play into that project a little bit. It's a two-part question. The first one, I'll just read it here, is do you think there was a realistic chance for US-Russia rapprochement and even Russia's integration with the West after the collapse of the USSR? Russia was definitely ready and it seemed like George H.W. Bush, as well as he was talking about the new security arch from Vancouver to Vladivostok. So could you say a bit more about that potential and who then derailed this process in your eyes?
The answer is yes, there was a chance. It could have gone either way. We're talking about a situation where the Soviet Union fell apart, as most of us know. And what Putin watched was the exploitation of Soviet resources by oligarchs west and east, invited by our Treasury guys, by our Harvard boys, by our own oligarchs, plundering the Russian economy and sort of captivating everything that was worth stealing. Now, my favorite statistic from that comes from the World Bank, okay? Between 1991 and 1995, the average age that a Russian male died, is a smart way of saying that, mortality rate, whatever. The average age that a Russian male died was 63 in 1991, and it was 57 4 years later in 1995. Do the math, folks. Think about that. Think about how people were dying on the streets. Think about how the Russian economy was completely sabotaged. Think about how the US proudly put Yeltsin in for 4 more years. And you don't have to believe me, you're going to look at the cover of Newsweek for that, for God's sake, you know? That's what Putin inherited. And he reached out when he took power and he said, look, we can do better. We can make this thing work. We can actually join NATO, or we can create a new European architecture. But you know what? That doesn't suit the Mickey Mouse. In a word, Eisenhower warned about the military industrial complex, the MIC. It has grown like Topsy, okay? He warned that the only thing that prevents this growth would be a well-informed citizenry. And we ain't got that. Instead, what we've got is not the Mick, but the Mickey Mat. Military, got a pencil? Military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex, okay? Why do I say media as in all caps? Because media is the linchpin. If the media is not owned and operated by the rest of the Mickey Mat, the thing doesn't work. That's where we are today. That's why I think the kibosh was put on all attempts to reach out to Russia. We needed an enemy. Russia was it. Without a good enemy, a plausible enemy, you can't make the Mickey Mat work.
Thank you, Ray. And just for the follow-up question by Ed, it's another very strong question that touches upon this question of potential and aborted potential. Just a little bit later, he says, was there a second chance after 9/11 when Bush publicly praised Putin for his help in the Afghan operation and even hosted him at his Texas ranch in November 15th, 2001, declaring in front of Crawford High School students that his Russian counterpart is, quote, a new style of leader, a reformer, a man who is going to make a huge difference in making the world more peaceful by working closely with the United States. Ed says he was present at Putin's reception in Washington afterwards and heard him say that Russia is ready to work with the US as close as it chooses. So the question is, what went wrong at this time?
Well, very easy. Bush was not in charge. Cheney was. Rumsfeld was. John Bolton, of all people, were. Condoleezza Rice, an accessory. And these are the people running things. These are the people that got out of the ABM treaty, as I mentioned before. So Bush was, he was grandiose. He liked to say these things. But, just like Joe Biden after him, he can't make any good things he says about Russia stick. So that's my short answer to that. What else did I want to say about that? I've lost my thought. There was something very, very trenchant I was about to say, but maybe we'll come back.
Yeah, if you're inspired again, if the thought is recovered, feel free to just jump in no matter when. Okay, we're going to open up now to field some questions. Again, like I said, the list is a little bit long in the queue, so I'm going to ask everyone when I do call upon you to keep your question as concise and as brief as possible. The first question that came in on the queue was Bill Gribble. Bill, are you there? And also, everyone is on mute by default, so you have to take yourself off of mute before speaking.
Hi, Ray. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us all this policy information. But I have a question regarding this last week. I live in Italy. I've lived here for about 20 years. But I watch what's going on back in my birthplace, and that would be the States. And it's been alarming. And enough of the statement, but my question is, in 75, the church committee ferreted out Operation Mockingbird, which you just discussed in terms of the propaganda machine from the intelligence. And this last week, there was announcements that Strzok, FBI agent, is working for, or was working for the CIA. Possibly some of the documents that were just grabbed from Mar-a-Lago. Then we have Hayden chiming in that, that is an ex-CIA director and NSA, that maybe Trump, should be executed per the Rosenbergs. And I mean, this has gone way over the line in my mind. I'm glad I live in Italy. And I'm insulated somewhat, but could you comment on, again, Operation Mockingbird really had no results, did it? And it seems now to have been expanded.
Well, Bill, that's a really good question. I just read this morning that Peter Strzok, whose emails with his paramour showed chapter and verse about the deep state involvement in, number one, trying to prevent Trump from becoming president, and number two, emasculating him after he was president, that this fellow, Peter Strzok, is now a professor at Georgetown University. When you talk about the Mickey Mouse, you know, remember that last tail end, academia, think tank, it's all very powerful. They're all in that together. And, you know, I have to tell you that my mentor, to the degree I ever became a real journalist, I was a journalist at CIA for a while, for most of my career. But my real journalist sponsor was Bob Perry, Robert Perry. And, you know, his example was just incredible. And what I want to mention here is simply that his last substantive article, he checked with me first. I don't think he ever did that before. But the Strzok paramour emails became available. And Bob called me, Bob Perry, and he said, my God, Ray, do you see this the way I do? And I did. He said, this is FBI gate. This is Russia gate. This is FBI gate. Now, that was a couple of months before Bob died, unfortunately. But, you know, that's what it was. And if you look really carefully, that's what it still is. Now, I have to tell you, my wife always says, Ray, for God's sake, always remember to tell any audience what you think of Donald Trump. And I think he was the very worst president that the United States ever had. That doesn't mean a broken clock can't be right. Was it once or twice a day? Huh? Okay. He's right about this. The Russiagate, people like Strzok thrive. People who pointed out the indignities of it and the injustice of it and the lying, and like Hayden who lied, like who else? Brennan. All those guys were in it up to their necks, and it's going to be really interesting to see if the documents that Trump tried to get declassified the day before he left office, and I'm told Gina Haspel, the head of the CIA, and the people at Justice and the FBI said, well, yeah, we'll work on it. We'll work on it, right? And they know it declassified. Some fine day, they're going to come out. Some people I know have seen those documents, and they will be chapter and verse about the fact that Trump was not completely wrong on this one. Matter of fact, he had most of it right. And it's really a sad story, because court testimony shows now that his opponent, and someone named Mrs. Clinton, was at the bottom of all this and actually signed off on the more blatant lies, like the Alpha Bank thing, well before the election, and that Obama himself was well briefed and fully involved in so-called Russiagate. Now, bear in mind, I think there were 55 Russian diplomats thrown out because of this concocted Russiagate thing. So if you're looking at it from Putin's point of view, he's, God, can these guys be trusted? You know?
Thank you very much, Ray. That was a great response. Thank you.
Welcome, Bill.
All right, Peter, you're up.
Thank you very much, Matt. Hey, good afternoon, Professor McGovern. I have a question for you based upon your long service in the Central Intelligence Agency. Would you be so kind as to compare and contrast Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Thomas Moorer, who served during the Nixon administration, and current Chair General Millay?
Well, comparisons are invidious, but this one is especially invidious. Moorer was not only a highly ethical person, but he was smart as hell. Okay, really, really smart. And the thing that I applaud Mora for mostly is something that most people have no idea about, and that is that he didn't like the idea that the Israelis intentionally killed 34 US sailors on board the USS Liberty and wounded 174 others, and LBJ and the US Navy covered it up. Now, Moore ran his own investigation, made his own conclusions, came out with the truth. So that shows a guy who cares not only about the Navy, but about the truth, damn the political consequences. That sad story, the attack on the USS Liberty, which was deliberate. We have the intercepts, you know, but that's an American flag. Follow your orders, strike that ship. We have those things and nobody knows about it. And were people to know about it, they would realize one of the key episodes where the Israelis realized that they could get away with murder, literally, not just Rachel Corrie, not just Abu or Shireen Abu Akleh, but 34 US sailors aboard an intelligence collection ship in international waters. Moore was head and shoulders above any other Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman except one, and that was General Vesey, a brown shoe Army guy, got his commission during World War II. I knew him well. I used to brief him every other morning. He was golden too. He told the truth. And Millie is a cipher to me. And, you know, the thing that I remember most about him is calling up the Chinese and saying, no, we're not gonna have a nuclear, we're not gonna strike on you. I mean, this guy, Trump may be crazy, but we're not gonna do it. I mean, hello? Did he call up the Chinese this time around? I don't think so. Well, what do the Chinese think about that? You know, it's just Millie is. People who know Millie better than I don't have a very good opinion of him. But I say comparisons are invidious. Moore versus Millie is particularly invidious. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was
Don't call me
answer.
I'm not a professor. I never made it.
Hey, but I'm learning by you, so I'll call you Professor, and it's good to find mentors like you and Matthew and Martin.
Thank you.
And Cynthia.
As another little distasteful thing, there we go. We got a little infiltrator here. Alexander. Cynthia, can you boot Alexander?
Okay, so don't let anyone else in because they seem to be problem makers.
I hear you.
It seems to be one person who keeps changing his name. It was
at this
Alexander, then Obama, then Alex.
Yeah, exactly. So at this point, if you didn't get into the show at this point, you're not going to get it. But all right, that was interesting. Okay, so back on track. Paul, I know you've been waiting for a while. Again, all the questions have to be kind of short. So Paul, go for it. Launch your thought.
Okay, thanks. In September 2021, your host here still described 9/11 as an intelligence failure. I wonder whether he has any second thoughts about that, and also about the relevance of the reluctance to acknowledge the truth about 9/11. The way that still has a massive effect in international relations and in terms of the understanding of people's understanding of America as a trusted, as a country that one can possibly trust.
Thank you for your question. The 9/11 Commission was a cover-up, pure and simple. You don't have to believe me. Governor Kane and Lee Hamilton, co-chairs of the commission, mind you, wrote a book 2 years later saying we were set up to fail. We were not given enough money, enough time, enough people, and enough access to sensitive information. So we were set up to fail. Well, isn't that great? Isn't that terrific? These guys put out this fancy book and they realized in doing it that they were set up to fail. So my attitude is that there is a real story here. It needs to come out. I'm from New York City. I lost a friend on top of one of those buildings, okay? And so I applaud all these people who are denigrated by being called conspiracy theorists. All they're trying to get at is the truth, and I applaud that, okay? Now, that having been said, what else?
Do you maybe support Richard Gage's work as AE 9/11 Truth? And very interestingly, he's now connected. He's saying we can draw parallels between 9/11 Truth and COVID Truth.
Well, that may be, and that's beyond my, I really haven't focused on the COVID truth thing, but the other note I put down here from your initial question had to do with intelligence failure. I don't know who did it. On balance, I would have to say that Al-Qaeda did it. And why do I say that? Because I know people at the National Security Agency who had intercept material a few days before 9/11, which General Michael Hayden, director of NSA at the time, either sat on or gave to Dick Cheney, who said, sit on this, don't disseminate this. I know that because some of our friends and veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity have told me that, and their trustworthiness is in no question at all. So, was it intelligence failure? If the story, basic story of these Al-Qaeda guys is correct, well, yeah, the CIA really screwed up because they wanted to protect those two fellows out in the West Coast to be their own sources, never told the FBI, if that's true. The FBI screwed up in many instances, the one in Minnesota, for instance, the one down in Florida. NSA screwed up royally. So you have all kinds of screw ups in the intelligence thing. It really would take a whole, I don't know, I would imagine it takes some person to put this all together and say, okay, you guys all screw up here, and then we'll have our event, and then we can do what we want. So as you could say, I'm sort of undecided yet, but I do know enough to know that if those hijackers were who everyone says they were, then there were all kinds of intelligence failures, most markedly by General Michael Hayden, who had that information. We had the Al-Qaeda center, telephone center, in our view, well before 9/11, and we knew what was going on. And I'll leave it at that. You could talk to some of these folks and find out more.
Can I just very quickly, Matt?
Paul, we have a very long list, Paul.
Okay,
You're
sorry.
gonna have to have some patience here. All right.
Just
I think Ray has said what he can say about this topic, and we're gonna have to go to the next question. Okay. All right. Thank you, Paul. Okay, Leticia.
Hello, Mr. McGovern. Thank you for being here for us. So just a couple of points and then a quick question. So the US has never met a treaty they would never honor. Recently in June, Mike Pompeo said at the Hudson Institute, no matter the consequences, in regard to meeting their goal of controlling global resources. Unelected policymakers, what is our recourse? That would be my question. Is it de-dollarization? I mean, these lunatics, if I were to say that, I'd be thrown in jail and never to be seen again. Yet these people are out open in public. And I mean, we see what's happening now all over the world. China, Russia, there's Crimea, what is it? Estonia, the Baltics. So those nations are rallying up to, what is our recourse? Is there a recourse? Thank you.
I would just point to right after World War II. I'm proud to have been alive during the entire war. I wasn't very bright at the time. I was only 1 to 5. But after the war in 1947, George Kennan, who used to be my hero, composed the first State Department policy planning paper. And it said quite blandly that, look, after the war, we end up with ownership or disposed at our disposition 50% of the world's resources. We only have 6.9% of the world's population. So our task obviously has to be to maintain this disparity. And we can't be diverted by talks about human rights or those wishy-washy, you didn't say wishy, those other things. We have to be ready for great power actions, period, end quote. Now, then we could do that. Up until relatively recently, we could do that. We can't do that anymore. But these guys that are sort of educated in the George Kennan frame of work and can't change like he did when he said that expanding NATO would be the stupidest thing anybody ever did since the World War. We can't really change that. We're at the mercy of these people. And that's why I started out by saying, you know, Biden, just like Bush, we thought we had to assume that Bush didn't know that he was being taken down the garden path by Cheney and Rumsfeld. We gave him the benefit of the doubt because how else could we address him, right? So we said, look, you really need to broaden the number of your advisors beyond those already intent on making a war that would have a catastrophic end to consequences would be catastrophic. So we have to kind of make sure that we spread the truth around and say, look, Biden, you can't do this, especially under the influence of these wet behind the ear advisors that have already gotten you into real trouble deep. Thanks.
Yeah. John, could you ask one of your 2 questions, please?
Thank you, Ray. This was very interesting. I had seen the warning that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin had given back in 2016, but exactly the same video. And it was only on that video that I was able to see it. I certainly didn't see it in any Western newspaper, and I read regularly newspapers from all over the world. The 2 treaties proposed by the Russian Federation, the first with the USA, the second with each of the members of NATO, insist on NATO returning to 1997 borders, i.e. to Germany, and the withdrawal of US and UK nuclear weapons from Western Europe. How could this be forced by Russia? And I'll follow on with what Ratislav Yashchenko proposed might actually happen. That Russian troops will have to take Poland, the Baltics, half of Germany, possibly more, and some form of new Austro-Hungarian Empire will be formed, along with some form of Carolingian Empire. So is Yushchenko's image plausible? And do you have any ideas on how Russia might continue its special military operation once it reaches Lvov?
Well, thanks for your question, John. Let me answer this way. I think in any negotiation, and that's what was in the works in December of last year, you tend to put out your maximal demands, right? Now, I always thought, pushing back to the borders of 1997 and driving out nuclear weapons, that's pretty far reach. I saw that as a negotiating ploy. I saw that would disappear if other desired things would happen. So I think that's the way I would read that. Now, with respect, is it a little more important, this business about the Baltics and Poland? The Baltics and Poland, of course, would have you believe, and so would some prominent academics in the West, that Putin has his eye on the Baltics and his eye on Poland, okay? Who is it? Fiona Hill, who studied under Richard Pipes. She knew what was going on, and she warned in the New York Times 3 months ago, Russia is trying to drive us out of Europe. And they're saying when you're out of there, that don't let the doors hit your rear end on the way out. Her words, right? Now, okay. Now I'm going to take issue with what I call the Rudy Giuliani dictum. Some of you will recall that when he tried to persuade the head legislator in the legislature of Arizona to investigate all kinds of election irregularities, 2020, that representative said, well, my God, yeah, well, what's your evidence? And Giuliani said, oh, we have lots of theories, no evidence. Well, where's the evidence that Putin wants to mess around with Poland, mess around with the Baltics? Have you been in the Baltic state? Would mess around with the Baltic state? Why ever would he want to do that? I mean, even if he did, where is the evidence? There's no evidence that he wants to do that. As a matter of fact, there was no evidence before the coup in Kiev that Putin wanted to take Crimea back. It's very, very clear that he had no intention of doing that until he was provoked. That word again, provoked. Was the taking of Crimea provoked? It sure as hell was. Was the taking of, with other things provoked? Yeah, they were. So my short answer to that is that if you don't have any evidence that Russia is expansive or expansionist like the Soviet Union, then you really shouldn't be claiming to know that they have their eyes on Poland next or on the Baltic states. You should look really, really carefully at those who say those things and what their motivation might be, and particularly if they follow the Rudy Giuliani dictum of lots of theories, but no evidence. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Stephen Doyle, are you still there?
I am indeed. Thanks, Ray. Really enjoyed the talk. I'll try to be brief. I have a quick question in trying to sort out in my mind what's going on domestically in the US vis-a-vis what you're talking about, Russia and Ukraine. It seems to me that the same deep state establishment in the US that is, to me, terrified of Trump and his power base is part of the broader international entity that is livid on Ukraine. I'm wondering if it's possible that there may actually be a form of Russia collusion, but not in the negative sense, in the positive sense of Tsar Alexander and the Civil War and sending Russian troops to help the Union. Is it possible that there is some backdoor cooperation between an element of the military or the US establishment and Russia? And if so, after the Russian denazification of Ukraine happens, could we envision a similar thing in the US via an internal policing action?
Wow. I guess I don't see any evidence of that. I think Putin's got his plate full in Ukraine and supporting his friend out in the Far East, Xi Jinping. I've not seen any evidence of this kind of connection. That may be simply because I haven't looked so closely at these things, but I can't really say that I see much evidence of that.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
All right, we're getting through this list. Messi, are you still there?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Perfect. Firstly, thank you for having this talk, Mr.
Oh, could you make it a little bit louder? Is that possible?
Yeah. What about now?
Better.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for having this talk, Mr. McGovern. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Secondly, you mentioned a book. This is just a really quick clarifying question before my question. You mentioned a book earlier on the 9/11 Commission being like not.
Messi, maybe just speak more into your mic, because when you say how is it now, you are audible, but then you, I think, move away from it or something.
All right. How about now? Perfect.
At the moment, yes. Just keep doing what you're doing.
I'll just speak really quickly then. You mentioned a book earlier. This is just a clarifying question before my actual question. You mentioned a book regarding the 9/11 Commission and it being covered up, and I didn't quite catch the name of it. Do you can you?
Yeah, it's the 9/11 Commission report, the official report of the commission.
Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so my question is, were there any events prior to establishing the IPS organization that influenced you to create the organization that you can tell us at least? And if so, do you see a logic behind these various events in history lining up between the Vietnam War, Kennedy assassination, weapons of mass destruction, media narrative motivations, and so on?
Well, let me deal with the first part of your question first.
Sure.
Yeah, the motivation was quite clear. We had, believe it or not, in the analysis directorate of the CIA, made our careers on telling the truth. Now, this may be a stretch for you, but we, at least working on Russia, working on China, working mostly on Europe, we're not only given free rein, but we're given career protection for telling the truth, okay? So now, when Bill Casey and Bobby Gates came into power, that's 1980 or so, that started to be eroded, but there was still a real core of us devoted to the kind of exposure that Martin Luther King talked about. So when we saw our former colleagues manufacturing intelligence to support an unnecessary war, well, that's as bad as it gets. And so there were 5 of us initially, now we're up to 50 or so, who said, you know, we learned a lot, we know a lot, we should be listened to, so let's form this little group. And as I say, our first issuance was on the day that Colin Powell spoke. We gave him a C- for content, an A for delivery, but we were the only ones out there right away, because we had an AFP contact to put it right out on a wire in those days. So we were the only ones to take a different view from all the established press, saying what he said was irrefutable, you know, indisputable, just like Colin Powell said. So yeah, that's what really got us going. And the rest of your question, if I recall it correctly, is pretty much a lecture. I'd be happy to give it a subsequent time.
All right.
We might call on you on that. Okay, next up, Thomas. Thomas Mifek, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. Can you hear me? Everything fine?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for bringing on such guests. Just for Raymond, I served briefly as an intelligence officer in the Canadian Forces before taking my release and moving from Canada back to the Czech Republic. And I was just interested, was there any active participation by any of the Western intelligence services in behind any of the three Soviet interventions in Europe. The Berlin 1953, I think it was, the uprising in Hungary 56, and then of course the Czechoslovak Prague Spring in 1968. I thought someone of your background have some information on that.
Well, as for 53, that precedes my tenure, old as I am. And I have to really tell you that the analysis directorate was hermetically sealed off from the operations people in CIA. Basically, there are two CIAs. When I arrived at CIA headquarters, there were turnstiles on every floor separating the analysis people from the operations people. You couldn't go through the turnstile unless you had special permission, okay? So we didn't know, or we as analysts didn't know much about what was going on the other side. Whether, I suspect there was some meddling in 53 since we had all kinds of assets in there, but I don't know. That's just a suspicion. Hungary, I don't think so. I do know this about Hungary and about Czechoslovakia in 68. I know that there was great regret in the US government that we egged on the Hungarians to, to try to shoot those tanks and, actively resist because of what happened to that resistance. And so here's a little vignette. When I became senior enough to be, to be sent overseas, my first job was with Radio Free Europe. It wasn't acknowledged as a CIA outfit at the time, but it has been since acknowledged. And my primary job was to make sure that that didn't happen with respect to Czechoslovakia. Okay. Now the Prague Spring was blooming. I mean, it was there was euphoria throughout our government. Dubček, the Russians can't do a damn thing about Dubček. Well, I felt differently. I felt it was just a matter of months before the Russians would have to intervene. And so did the head of RFE. None of his people thought it, but he did. So here I am in Munich advising the head of RFE. The invasion happens. He looks at me and he says, well, we can't take any solace in being right. Let's make sure that those Czechs realize that the US is not going to come to their aid, that they should cease, that they should not acquiesce, but they're not going to be able to expect the US to come to their aid, as many Hungarians had, okay? And so that was largely my job. Now, the Prague Spring may have been helped by foreign Western services. I never saw any concrete evidence of that. But again, I would have been among the last people to know that, given those turnstiles between the operations people and the analytic people. Now, people, find that hard to believe, but all I can say is that if we needed to know something, it was only our very top people who would hear it from the operations people, come down and say, okay, by the way, you should know this. Otherwise, we were cut out.
I haven't heard anything in here from the local sources, but neither have I been researching it. But, let's say just from any news or documentary, nothing that I heard of that there were Western involvement. It was purely indigenous.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Harinder, I know you have two questions, but as I mentioned in the chat box, if you could narrow it down to one of the two that you prefer, that would be really appreciated. Are you still there, Harinder? Oh, we might.
You're muted, Harinder. You're muted.
Oh, yeah, you're muted, Harinder. You got a bottom left-hand side. Yeah, there you are. Okay.
Mr. McGovern, thank you for your presentation. very quickly, before the question, I'll just mention that there are several books by Professor David Ray Griffin, in my view, completely blowing up the US government theory about 9/11, which I would recommend you read. Now, coming on to the question, last year there was a lot of hysteria about the Biden administration's pullout from Afghanistan, how it was botched and so on, and some of it still goes on. My question is, do you believe, at least my theory is that they did this because they decided suddenly that they were going to move, they were going to push Russia into the Ukraine invasion proxy war, and then follow up quickly with these provocations in Taiwan. And that's why they pulled out of Afghanistan to focus on these two major proxy wars. What would be your opinion on that?
Well, I would say that would be crazy, but I would caveat that with the notion that these people are crazy. I mean, they have this geopolitical thing, doesn't make any sense anymore, okay? So the way I look at the Afghan thing is that it was high time to get out of there. Trump had sort of taken the brunt of the blame for the pullout. He set a date and all that kind of stuff. And Biden looked at it and he said, all right, well, let's farm this out to the State Department and the Pentagon to pull these people out. Now, I think, and this is just a suspicion, that the Pentagon didn't want to pull out. And so they made it just as bad as it possibly could be with respect to how we got out of there.
To embarrass the president? Is that why?
Yeah, yep. General, what was his name? The guy who was head of the Afghan outfit there, name will come to me in a second. These people are insubordinate, pure and simple. And when the president and these guys in the State Department overrode the military on this, he decided, well, all right, I'll pull these people out of Bagram. And once I pull them out of Bagram, oh God, everything will fall apart, but that's what he wants. That's what I got to do. So he does it in the middle of the night, right? And then he announces, oh, we're out of Bagram. What does that mean? Well, you know what that meant, okay? So that's my suspicion. In any case, it was time to get out of there. Whether they had this more grandiose plan to sort of concentrate on Ukraine, I doubt it. I think the stupidity and elitism has their own role to play in this. And with respect to China, I just can't conceive of a country that has its head screwed on right, that want to take China and Russia on at the same time. And I understand from talking with Matt in the past that there were things going on inside Taiwan, very much akin to what we did in Ukraine with that coup in February of 1914. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to believe that sensible people would have this attitude this late in the day, because they still think that the triangle is at least equilateral, whereas, as I said before, Russia and China together have the upper hand in this. And I hope that our policymakers get to realize that before it's too late.
But you know that even Pelosi's visit has been followed up by other officials going to Taiwan, continuing the provocation of China, which is already there with hundreds of military bases and the 3 aircraft carrier groups in the region and all that. So
yeah.
What you're saying is logical, and yet all the evidence is that they want to pursue this insanity, which could blow up into a global nuclear war.
Yeah, and if you're looking at it from the Chinese perspective, which I try to, well, what's this all about? What are they trying to do? Are they really trying to create a sovereign Taiwan despite their previous promises? And maybe we ought to give them a bloody nose. Now, my Chinese expert friends say, no, China doesn't want war. Well, I accept that. China doesn't want war. But they have sort of the opportunity to make it really messy for US warships. And what I look to is the Pentagon, the White House says a couple of weeks from now, they're going to send warships into the Taiwan Strait. Now, my Chinese analysts say, no, the Chinese not going to do anything about that. They never do anything about them. Well, I'm not so sure. I think there may be a real possibility of extreme harassment, maybe even an attempt to blockade them from going. And who will blame whom for that kind of thing? I think the world will look on and say, is this a people being provoked?
So when you said harassment, in that case, you meant harassment of Taiwan by China through sending warships there.
No, I mean harassment of the warships. Harassment of the U.S. warships. Yeah.
Harassment by the U.S. warships?
No, in other words,
by China.
Yeah, China,
Okay.
you know, has got this, could have X number of exercises there. While
Yeah,
this,
which they have started. They've had some, yeah.
So I think it's a new world out there, and I think our policymakers should be aware of that, and I suspect they're not.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Kirsten, I know in the past we've had a little bit of trouble with your audio. Are you able to get your audio working, or do I read out your question? Where are you? Kirsten, I don't even see you.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I have the question, if there's anything you can say to the situation of Julian Assange.
Yes, I can. This is as important a juncture as the United States and the free world has faced in decades. We have the First Amendment in our Constitution in danger of being subverted by prosecuting a publisher who is not even a member, not even a citizen of the United States. What this means for press freedom is very insidious. Now, all I can say, and I know Julian quite well, I used to visit him in the Ecuadorian embassy. I dare say he's a good friend of mine. What I know is that he was tarred with that wonderful arrow in any intelligence services quiver, rape, sexual misbehavior, okay? And what I also know is that Niels Melzer, the UN rapporteur for torture, speaks excellent Swedish. And Niels was motivated to go to Sweden and review the police records. And what he found was this was all a setup. Yes, Julian had relations with these two women. They didn't want to prosecute him. It was all consensual. All they wanted for him was to take an AIDS test, okay? And that was distorted by the Swedish police, no doubt with help from friendly intelligence services, into making Julian Assange the equivalent of a rapist with no factual basis. Now, how did Niels Melzer find that out? I don't know if the Swedes knew this, but he's fluent in Swedish, right? As I think I mentioned before. So it was a bum rap to begin with. They just wanted to get their hands on him. And as I say, if there is a extradition, and if the US can make good on its commitment, not only to torture, which Julian has been psychologically tortured at least, but to put somebody away for 65 years, no matter who he is, no matter where he reports from, no matter what citizenship he has, that's going to have an incredibly coercive, a suppressive effect on any decent reporting having to do with intelligence and other secrets. So my hat's off to Julian. I hope that we succeed in preventing him from being extradited. And I appeal to my Australian friends to stand up for their co-citizen. You know, it used to be Chivus Romanus sum. Paul, St. Paul, you know, I'm a Roman citizen. Whoa, okay, hands off. We'll send him to Rome. Chivus Australiensis sum. Doesn't mean anything if you're an Australian citizen. nor would it mean anything with any of these other vassals the United States has. So this is really, it couldn't be more important. And one of my regrets, of course, is that the US press is just, as long as they get handouts from the Pentagon and the CIA, they're just happy to get paid big bucks. You know, what's happened to the fourth estate? It's gone downhill. The fifth estate was Julian's creation. Now that too is being pretty much sublimated to the Mickey Man. Thanks for your question.
I've got a quick little follow-up. I haven't properly kept track as much as I should. Julian has shaped history as we know it. I mean, his intervention has literally changed a lot and introduced potentials we never would have had. But what are there any opportunities now at this point to reverse the extraction to the US? What is left available for activists and for the judicial system to work with to break the his being sent to the US?
Well, there are a bunch of staunch people in London who are trying their best, and it's easy to get in touch with them, AssangeDefense.com or whatever. And it's just a matter of sensitizing people. First and foremost, journalists, for God's sake, have they no shame? Can't they stand up for somebody who violated no laws, just exposed the secrets that the military and CIA wanted to keep hidden? I mean, you know, it's really quite bad, quite apart from being a friend of Julian. And the latest thing, which you may not know about, is there's a lawsuit in the United States against the Spanish firm that was hired by the CIA to take the cell phones of all visitors to Julian and exploit them to a fare-thee-well at the embassy. Now, that happened. It's factually, there are films of it, for God's sake. So the question is, there's a Fourth Amendment in the United States Constitution against unreasonable searches and seizures without a warrant, okay? That was important back then. It's still important. So they're pursuing that legal aspect, but that will not have a lot of influence, I don't think, on what goes on in Britain. What we need to do is be active in London and thereabouts and do what we can to expose the injustice that's being committed here.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, 2 more questions. John, you've been waiting for a while. John Atcha, I'm not too sure. You're on mute, John.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure. Is it Atcha John or John Atcha? What?
Well, just John. It's Atcha John is my handle on the net. I just use that phrase,
okay.
if you like that. Hi. I need help with hello there. I need help with an attitude or an approach. I've understood where you've gone today in my way, but really, this chaos, this disregard for life, these attitudes of the Americans, the British, to an extent, the Germans are coming into it. May I ask, what do we think? What do we do? Where do we go? How do we approach this in a solid and constructive manner? Where do we go, please? What do we do?
Well, that's the $64 question, of course. The problem is, how do we get the word out? I think most Americans, most British, most everyone has a sense of fairness here and a sense of what it means to have a free media. The problem is, at least here in the United States, they don't know the story about Julian Assange. You run into somebody and say, Julian, I'll have a shirt on. Or, oh, he's the rapist. He's the rapist, you know? I mean, that's how bad it is. So people are very ill-informed. The best I know how to do is to keep plugging away, you know? And in the words of the Nuremberg prosecutor, Ferenc, he said, you only have to remember 3 things, okay?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you please repeat it?
Never give up.
I'm not sure.
Never give up. And never get up. Never give up.
No, that's. Oh wait, John is talking. I'm sorry, John. You're on mute. I heard you say a little follow up there.
Did you hear me?
No.
I'm just saying thank you, Mr. McGovern. That's all. I have no idea what else to do, and we will continue.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
I really appreciate this last question coming in from our friend Luke in Ottawa, because I think it gets us out of the realm of the literal, which can sometimes be a little overbearing, and into the domain of the creative, which I think is really needed right now, especially in a time when there's a lot of fear, and fear is a bad dance partner to creativity and hope and really constructive problem solving. So Luke's question is, and I'm guessing I'm supposed to ask it because he wrote it out. As someone who is obviously creative and very expressive, what is your experience, if any, with theater? How do you view the role of art and maybe theater when dealing with mankind's existential crisis or crises?
Thanks for that question. 2 days ago, I went and saw Roger Waters. This is not a drill, is the name he gave to his incredibly visual and pointed commentary on world events. I think he was in Ottawa, correct me if I'm wrong. But when you see something like that, latch onto it, grapple it to your heart with hoops of steel, as Shakespeare would say, and breathe it, because Roger has a way about him, and Roger is a friend of mine. He's an authentic person. He doesn't put on anything. He believes and he trusts, and he has this incredible instinct against injustice. As he explains it, as he was grappling with these things as a teenager, he went to his mother and he said, "How do I handle this?" And she said, "Well, first you read everything. You read everything you can to throw light on what's going on, what the issue is. And then, very easy, you go out and you do the right thing. Do the right thing." Now, those words rang in my mind because some of you are familiar with Daniel Berrigan, the Jesuit priest who was such an active opponent of the Vietnam War and spent lots of time in prison with the likes of Dan Ellsberg and others, okay? Last time I saw Father Berrigan, I told him, "Father Dan, a couple of my friends and I are going out to Moscow to visit Ed Snowden and to give him an award for integrity and intelligence. Would you have any, what would you like, if you were us, what would you tell him?" And he was pretty feeble and old at the time and not very loud. Tell him he did the right thing. And then I said, "Father Dan, I was talking with Dan Ellsberg 2 weeks ago, and I told him we were going to Moscow. What would you tell Dan Ellsberg at this point?" He looked at me and he says, "Tell him he did the right thing too." So I think that's what we're called on to do the right thing, taking into account the poetry that Dan Berrigan created, the courage that Dan Ellsberg manifested, and any art that we can bring into the service of raising consciousness, giving people an idea of the beauty of the world that we're sort of forfeiting, that we're sort of absconding with. And so, yeah, I really appreciate your question. The last thing I'll say is that I took my granddaughter to see the Van Gogh exhibition. It's a experience with surrounding of his paintings, and if that comes to your town, that will remind you of the beauty and the tragedy of real life, but most of all, the beauty. So art should play a role in this. I guess I'll tack on one more thing, and that is that we shall overcome. All right. I think I'm right in remembering that on Tiananmen Square, some of those Chinese students were singing "We Shall Overcome." And when I visited the Knesset in Tel Aviv and visited the Arab delegates who were there at the time, their meeting hall was plastered with portraits of not only Martin Luther King, but Rosa Parks. So you never know what example you'll be giving to people who have the same sense of justice and of art, music, and graphic arts that you have. So keep it up, and thanks for the question.
Yeah, that was a good question. And I think too, just to say one thing before we actually, as you were speaking, two messages from two of your old longtime friends and associates came in. So I'm gonna throw you two more things, Ray. I'm guessing you're still okay with time.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But just as the top of my head, I just wanted to share that I know that had it not been for immersing myself into a study of the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. and of John F. Kennedy, and just going to the writings of people like Lincoln, who made history and who sacrificed much more than their comfort for the sake of an ideal that was, very much tied to their conscience, I wouldn't have the strength personally to go through a lot of the challenges and process a lot of the bitter ugliness that we have to look at if we're going to make sense of world affairs, the history, the present. So I think that, and that's the case, a similar experience for Cynthia. I know for everybody in my world who has been able to overcome very depressing challenges that the world throws at us, it's because you tap into the compositions. And it's not, of great artists who were themselves able to overcome, and you see some of that, of their soul, and that overcoming within the creative works of art, of music, as well as, and I think, when you look at the speeches by Martin Luther King, it really is a poetic art being expressed. It's not just a speech. It's not a teleprompter thing. It's something more. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to share a little bit into the mix as well. The last, or the second to last thing came from Ed, again, still in Moscow, following up on his first two questions that we began with the Q&A session regarding the first and second potentials for something better to have arrived in 1989 to 91, and then how that was derailed, followed by the 2000-2001 hope that was derailed. He asks, finally, judging from the past experiences in dealing with Washington and the collective West, he's asking, should Russia abandon its Western nostalgia and look elsewhere for allies, friends, and partners? Of course, Ed is somebody who has been working very hard to reawaken the better part of America, as has you. So obviously, he is doing everything possible to make sure that the better US that is fit to survive can wake up at this late stage. But what are your thoughts on this?
Well, let me start by quoting very briefly Alexander Pushkin. «Сюда грозит, мы будем шведу, здесь будет город заложен, назло на медному соседу. Природа здесь нам суждено, в Европу прорубить окно». Okay? So that's Pushkin talking about Pyotr Veliki, Peter the Great, how he tried to not dent a window, but to prorubit, not only cut, but cut through a window to Europe. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Peter the Great, you should know that he spent 2 years on the wharves of Rotterdam. He knew something about what the West was like. He went incognito, of course, but he was the only czar at that time who would travel in the West. And he wanted to turn the West into, well, by nature, we are foreordained to beat a window into Europe. And what we're going to do is we're going to threaten the Shvedu, Sweden, the Swedes. I mean, hello, the Finns and the Norwegians. That's sort of the Nordics. So why? Well, after Russia, after 240 years, finally got rid of Genghis Khan and the Zalotaya, the gold, then they had to deal with the Shvedu and the Lithuanians and the Poles, all were before and after Peter the Great were invading Russia. But nonetheless, he made it stick. And Catherine the Great, of course, later moved us all the way down to Sevastopol in Crimea, where the Russians created a naval base. At the same time, we were having a revolution in the United States. So all I'm saying is that I find it very painful to not be able to avoid the realization that Putin has said, all right, we tried, forget about it. We're not going to deal with these guys anymore. And his tone, no more partners, no more partners. There are other adjectives or nouns that he uses. So he's decided, well, look, brother, my best friend, or as Xi Jinping calls Putin, his best friend, he's got open arms. He's facing the same common enemy. And besides, we got Indians and we got the Belt and Road. We're gonna look east for a while. And I have no idea that the West realizes what a deprivation, what an impoverishment of Western civilization it will be without the Russians. And I may exaggerate this a little bit, and I think Putin will be open, and the Russians will be open to a more favorable atmosphere in the West. But what's happening now is a crime against humanity in terms of turning away an incredibly talented people. When Obama said, "Oh, yeah, it's just a gas station," or what was it? McCain said, "That's just a gas station masquerading as a country." Right. So I can see Pushkin working the pump, and he says, "Hey, Gogol, what's that last thing you wrote?" And Tchaikovsky, play that music again. Right. Just a gas station. Give me a break. These people, well, hopefully they'll kind of fold away like the Arabs and silently steal away. And we'll have a more decent, educated populace to say, look, this war in Ukraine was not unprovoked, and we can show you that, okay? Was it illegal? Well, there are good people, good lawyers, saying that under the provisions of the UN Charter, there was a self-defense mechanism clicked in here. I'm not going to fight that legal battle, but provoked, of course it was provoked, and we got to stop provoking people because no longer are we up to it.
Mm-hmm. We'll end here with your friend Martin Seif, who has been waiting for a while. I know Martin has a thought to share.
Hey, Martin.
Ray, a joy as always. I don't have anything to add because it would be superfluous. Thank you. It is, as always, a pleasure and a privilege. And every time I've heard you speak and talk with you over the past 20 and more years, I always learn more. And you are in top form tonight. I think we all feel that. Thank you so much. Here's to the next time.
Thanks, Martin. Coming from you, that means a lot.
Oh, it's just a fellow Irish flatterer, Ray.
No, you're from the north, as I remember.
But my father was a Cork man.
Ah, all right.
There you are.
All right. Thank you so much from Moscow. Thank you for your answers, and hope to see you pretty soon on Russian TV.
Thank you, Ed.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time this Sunday afternoon. And thank you, Ray, so much for providing us a top-down, soulful appreciation of history, the present, and hopefully the future as well. This next Sunday, for those who are interested, the presentation will be delivered by Dr. Jonathan Tenenbaum, who has done a lot of work both on nuclear physics, but also on medical science, but also on music. And he's going to go through something on the question of classical composition, the different opposing schools within the thing we call classical music. It's not one big homogeneous thing. There are opposing currents He's going to go through a little bit of that next Sunday at 2 p.m. So if anybody wants to come and you're not getting the emails, send us an email to the Rising Tide website and we'll let you know. Thank you once again, Ray, so much.
Most welcome.
Thank you all. Thank you, Matt.
Take care, everyone.
And you folks.